Hello everyone, this is Brian Peasland and this is my video showing you how I use the SQL Developer product to make quick work of a SQL tuning session. I often get involved in a lot of different performance tuning tasks and most of them boil down to tuning SQL statements and nothing specific with rack, but if your SQL statements are not tuned correctly, then you may have issues, whether it be Oracle, rack, or single instance, no matter what. There are a number of tools to help identify poor SQL statements, AWR reports. One of my favorites is SolarWinds Database Performance Analyzer, or DPA. That's a great product. I really like Lighty these days by Orachrome. That's another great tool that I use all the time. But no matter where you get your SQL statements that need tuning, they seem to come in unformatted, need a little bit of help. And I thought I would show today how I use SQL Developer, which is free, as most of you probably know. So I'm just going to show you some tips and tricks on how I use the product. You may have your own preferences. These are just what works for me. I hope they help somebody else out, but maybe you have some other ideas as well, and if you do, feel free to share them with me. For this demonstration, it is important to note that I am using, at the time I recorded this video, the latest and greatest version of SQL Developer, which is 4.1. There's going to be a tip in here that I use that is only available as of 4.1. So if you're on an older version, you may not be able to use everything I show you here, and I will point that out when we get to it. Okay. So here I have a AWR report, and I've already gone through the AWR report for analysis. I'm not trying to show how to use an AWR report in here, but I've got one SQL statement here, which is at the top of the list, that I want to see what I can do to speed it up to make it faster. So the first thing I typically do is, I just simply cut and paste into SQL Developer. No big surprise here. But as you can see, my cut and paste from the source, it's not very formatted, it's harder to read. This is not a complex SQL statement. Some of the SQL statements that I work on can be very complex, very wordy, very verbose. And when I cut and paste from these tools, be it an AWR report, SolarWinds DPA, Lighty, or any of the other tools that I use, it often comes in as just one line with very little white space characters for readability. So the first thing I like to do, simply right click and say format. And that makes it a lot easier for me to see. A lot of times when I'm doing SQL tuning, I'm really concerned about which tables are involved in that statement. And with the manner with which it was before, if I undo that, it may be harder for me to see some of the details that I need, such as what's in the select clause, what's in the where clause. So the first thing I typically do in SQL Developer is I just use that quick format option. When I cut and paste, typically there's no semicolon at the end from these tools because they're getting the SQL text from $views within the Oracle instance. So a lot of times I simply just add it. And then I'm going to do an explain plan on it by pressing the explain plan button. And right away it tells me table or view does not exist. And this is very typical for me in that when I cut and paste from an AWR report, I'm signed on to the database instance as my user, and my user, my DBA user, typically does not own any of these objects. They're owned by application schemas. So for me, one of the things I want to find is I want to find who owns these tables. So the first thing I'm going to do is take this SQL statement and I'm just going to copy it into my clipboard, and then I'm going to open a second worksheet and paste it over here. And the reason I do that is because I want to go back to this original SQL statement untouched. I want to be able to come back to that after I formatted it. But here, because I formatted it, now I can quickly and easily go in and get rid of the select clause, the where clause, the join condition, and now I'm just left with the two table names. So now I want to find out who owns these tables. One of the things I also do is I tend to keep these table names in comments at the very top of this worksheet, because I'm going to cut and paste those later on, as we'll see. So right now I'm just trying to find out who owns these tables. Because those table names are all in lowercase, I'm going to take the table name column of the DBA tables view, and I'm going to convert that to lowercase so I can match my string. And I'm going to search for where those table names are in this list. So quite simply, I'm just now going to cut or copy and paste that down here. But it's not going to work because we're going to need some quotes around those, some single quotes. So I'm going to place my cursor at the beginning of this orders table, and then I'm going to then hold down the Control and the Shift key and press my left mouse button again, and now you can see I actually have two blinking cursors here. This is a brand new feature for SQL Developer 4.1. And I'm going to put my cursor at the end of each of those, and if you notice, I actually somehow screwed up and put a cursor in the middle of the orders table, right between the R and the S. But now I've got all these blinking cursors, and whatever action I type is now going to be replicated everywhere there's a cursor. So I am going to simply press a single quote, and now everybody has a single quote. I do have this one erroneous one which I have to simply remove, but quickly and easily I was able to put single quote at the beginning and the ending of every table. Now for two tables, this isn't a big deal, but sometimes I'm tuning an SQL statement that literally will have 15 or 20 tables in it. This is, to me, is much easier, this new feature of SQL Developer, to be able to add these single quotes all over the place. And I'm going to show you something else here very soon where I can save on a bunch of typing as well. And think about it again, when you have 5 or 7 or 10 tables involved, this sort of trick can really save some time. Okay, I had to put in that comma there between the two tables in my list. So now I can run the query, and I can see that all the tables are owned by the Scott schema. This is just a demonstration, this isn't real life. So now they're owned by Scott, so I can go back here and again use that Shift and Control together and type Scott dot in front of those table names. Now when I run the explain plan, it'll work. Okay, we can see the explain plan for the SQL statement. I'm just going to move the window up here. A lot of times I get rid of this other XML column. Sometimes these filter predicates are expanded out. If I right click on here, there's an option to expand the predicates and projection, and by default a lot of people would see something like this. And really, for the most part, unless I'm looking for something specific, I'm not worried about those details. I'm more worried about what objects are being accessed and how they're being accessed. So a lot of times I'll just come in here, right click, and collapse the predicates and projections. That seems to clean up my list a lot for me. It's not perfect, but it saves me a lot of clicking these minus signs to collapse those sections. The next thing I do, this explain plan you see in the window here is my baseline. This is where I start from. And I don't want to lose this information as I tune this SQL statement. So the next thing I'll do is I'll hit this little push pin, which pins that explain plan. So if I make changes and I come back to this SQL statement and I want to run the explain plan again to see the effect, I don't lose this baseline. I always can go back and compare to this state. Okay, we can see here that, I'm just going to drag this column over here. We can see the Scott orders table and the Scott orders details table. Both of those have full table scans on them. And the cost is $374, $377. But I suspect that these tables are probably quite lengthy, otherwise this would not have shown up as a problematic SQL statement. So a lot of times what I like to do is get some information about these tables. So I'm going to cut and paste these again, the Scott orders, and I'm going to go back to this worksheet here. And I could have just simply typed Scott dot the schema name dot in front of those as well. Depends upon my mood. But a lot of times I like to get some information about these tables. So what I will typically do is then look at some of the stats on the tables and when they were last analyzed. So select owner, table name, num rows, and last analyzed from DBA tables. When I cut and paste the SQL statement from the performance tuning tool that flagged that SQL statement, a lot of times it will have owner.table name in there. So one of the tricks that I do is I just put owner and I concatenate a dot and then I put table name. And again, I'm going to cut and paste my tables, and I will need to put in single quotes here. And put a semicolon. Because these are all lowercase, I will have to wrap this construct in the lower function as well. Okay? So this simple owner.table name in my where clause lets me go in and just simply cut and paste the owner.table name from the SQL statement that I received. So now I'll run this and I can see that the number of rows in these tables is about 85,000 and it was last analyzed. Well, that's today's date, but I do suspect that the stats are out of whack. So again, I don't want to lose this information because I'm going to come back and refer to it. So I'm going to press this little push pin here to save it so it doesn't go anywhere. And now I'm going to, again, copy and paste those table names here. But this time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call DBMS Stats, gather table stats, and I'm going to use that Shift and Control and press the left mouse key again to get rid of this period, the schema, add a semicolon, put in a comma, tab name, and again that Shift and Control. So now I've just generated quickly a call to DBMS Stats with that owner.table name that I had. And again, for two tables, this wasn't a big deal. When I have 15 tables involved in the SQL statement, this can be a big lifesaver. Okay, so I'm going to put a begin and an end, and I'm going to highlight all of that and press the run script, and it's going to go out there and generate the statistics on those two tables. Okay, and by the magic of editing, what was a few seconds for you, you can see was 69 seconds for me. So it did take a while, and if I'm taking 69 seconds to gather table stats on just these two tables, they must be sizable, or at least one of them must be. So I'm going to go back to this statement that I had run before, and I'm just going to execute that statement. And we can see that the order details table actually has 5.4 million rows. So if I go back to my initial query result, and this is why I pinned it, both of them had about 85,000 rows, but in reality one of them's way off. And a lot of times in a lot of the SQL statements that I tune, bad stats are a major problem contributing to the poor performance. Probably about 50% or more of the SQL statements I tune, once I update the statistics, the SQL statement works fine. So let's look at the explain plan. Remember, I pinned this so that I could refer to that as my baseline. So when I run the explain plan again, here I still have the two full table scans, but notice the cost on the order details jumped up significantly to 23,270. And the original cost was only 374. So now we at least have a truer picture of where we were at. Now this is not a demonstration on how to tune SQL statements, but I think it should probably be pretty obvious that the where clause is only on the order date column. I'm only looking at for orders in the last 24 hours. So it's probably a good idea on a 5 million row table to index that order date column. So I'm going to go back over here to my work area. And I'm going to create an index. Going back to that SQL statement that's being tuned, I also have a join on the order ID column of those two tables. So I'm going to create indexes on those. So these are my 3 create index statements, and I am going to execute those now. And again, with the magic of editing, I'll come back once these are done so you don't have to sit and watch them take forever. Okay, the indexes are done, so now I'm going to get rid of this explain plan, and I'm going to regenerate the explain plan again. And now things look a lot better to me. Now I am accessing the orders table and the order details table only by the index. I'm not even accessing the tables themselves anymore. And the cost is now down to 226 total. One of the other things I can do in SQL Developer is I can right click on this tab here and say compare with explain plan. So now it's going to give me a side-by-side comparison between the two. And I find this very helpful after I've made some changes to go in, and you can see in the beginning I had my 2 full table scans here, and now I'm doing index range scans and not even touching the table. So to me that's a big benefit. Okay, so to recap, this wasn't a SQL tuning seminar by any stretch. This is a pretty simple SQL statement that was tuned. I just wanted to show a few tips and tricks on how I use SQL Developer to make quick work of tuning this statement. The tricks I used were simply to use the SQL Developer format functionality in the worksheet to take whatever I cut and paste for the SQL statement from an AWR report or wherever and get it into something quickly more readable. And then I pinned the initial explain plan over here so I could have a baseline to come back to it. In my other SQL worksheet, I kept this list of tables here because I used them a couple different places. One was to get the owner, who owns those tables, because I didn't know for sure, or I may not know for sure. And then I did something similar to get the number of rows in the last analyzed. And remember, I used the control and shift as I clicked with the left mouse button to be able to add these single quotes. I also use that same functionality, that control shift with the left click, to generate my DBMS Stats calls. And that's basically how I use SQL Developer quickly and easily. What used to take me a lot longer, running explain plans in SQL Plus and manually formatting these SQL statements and manually typing a bunch of things, now becomes much quick work with a proper tool. I hope you found this video informative, and I hope it helps you become more proficient in your SQL tuning. Thanks. Goodbye.